my name is Abigail Finley, and today we're going to be talking about Rosa Parks and her impact on the civil rights movement. So, before we get started on the specifics about Rosa Parks herself, I think it's significant to acknowledge just the historical background that's coming into the civil rights movement and the experiences that people have going into it. So the first one is just like the establishment of Jim Crow laws after the Civil War, which just legalized segregation predominantly in the South, or the separation of blacks and whites in public facilities and at private businesses as well. So after that, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which just stated that people had the right to full and equal enjoyment of different facilities. And that was struck down in 1883 because it was determined that the federal government did not have control over private businesses and whether or not they allowed for segregation. They could not say that segregation was illegal. That was not their place. And then that was challenged in 1896 with the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And the action that Homer Plessy took was intentional. He was 1/8 African American. And so when he sat down in the white portion of the bus and the conductor at the time, who's Ferguson, found out, he came and told Plessy that he needed to move, and he refused, and Plessy was arrested, and this case went all the way up to the federal courts. And the argument on Plessy's side was essentially that it was interstate commerce, which means that it is something that is happening between two states and therefore within the jurisdiction of the federal government and doesn't fall under like the state or private institutions' realm of control. That at that time, the federal government said that the segregation was technically allowed as long as separate but equal facilities were given to the public. And this was a precedent that is going to stay in place within American government and society up until it is challenged and eventually overturned with Brown versus the Board of Education. And then beyond segregation, I think it's significant to acknowledge the fact that many Black Americans at the time are facing really intense violence, which is expressed through the case of Emmett Till. In 1955, he was on a trip with his mother. He was accused of assaulting a white woman, and then with no evidence, a mob of white citizens of that town abducted him, beat him up, and murdered him. And his death was just so brutal that it kind of sent shockwaves throughout the whole country. And his mother's reaction to that as well, having an open casket funeral, was really just a statement to the public that this community was tired of the violence and separation and oppression that they were facing. When it comes to Rosa Parks herself, she was born February 14th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her father was James McCauley. He was a stonemason. He was not super present in her life, so he didn't have a major impact on her. Her mother, however, Leona Edwards, she was a rural school teacher and had a huge impact in her daughter's life. She really emphasized not only the significance of religion and faith, but also in a significance in receiving a good education. She grew up in Pine Level, Alabama on her grandparents' farm, and she attended the Industrial School for Girls and the Alabama State Teachers College. At the time she was at this teacher's college, she did not receive her diploma because she had to go back home to help her sick grandmother, but she eventually did get her high school diploma, which I know for us at the time seems like a relatively minor achievement. But at the time, not only for women, but also for Black women to receive that level of education, it was a pretty big deal. And then I don't think we can talk about Rosa Parks without discussing the importance of her faith. She attended the Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopalian Church as a child, and that was just where her not only drive to participate in civil rights movement, but also her foundation of faith kind of started. And then at the age of 19, she married her husband, Raymond Parks. She got married on December 18th, 1932. He was a barber, but beyond that, he was an activist. They were a great team together. One of the things he participated in was a Scottsboro Boys defense. It's also just important to discuss this case because it was another pretty big um, case that was active during the mid 1900s that had a significant impact on the civil rights movement. And it was basically 9 young Black boys who were on a train in northern Alabama, were at the scene when 2 white men instigated a fight. And when the police arrived, the white men accused the young boys of raping 2 white women who were on the train. And all 9 boys were arrested. It went to court. Not all 9 boys were convicted of the crime, even though they hadn't done anything. 8 of the 9 were given the death sentence, and the only reason the 9th was saved from that was because he was so young compared to the others. And collectively, all 9 of them served 100 years in prison for a crime they did not commit. Now, when we discussed Rosa Parks, a pretty consistent theme I found, not only just like trying to research her, but also reading articles about her and past experience in the classroom, is that her life is kind of reduced down to a single moment when she refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. But when you look at her childhood and then just like her married life and young adult life, like she was active in many different civil rights groups and organizations and actions throughout her whole life. She talks about like experiencing racism as a child and how her and her grandfather like would have discussions about how she needed to like keep vigilant and watch out for like KKK activities in the community. She talks about being harassed on the playground by a young white boy and how she had to like scare him off with a brick in order to get him to leave her alone. But beyond that, she's active in groups like the NAACP. She joined in 1943, at least the Montgomery chapter of it. And just like a brief little background about the NAACP, it was started in 1908 out of a deadly race riot in Springfield, Alabama. And they had many different goals and accomplishments, but some of like the significant things they did, they worked on reducing the number of hangings taking place in the South. They made job discrimination illegal under the Roosevelt administration, which is a pretty significant move. But what we're going to mainly focus on is just their emphasis on legal action for the civil rights movement. So not only did they support people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., but they also gave legal advice and lawyers to cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, which we discussed previously, overthrew not only the Plessy versus Ferguson case, but also desegregated public schools. One thing about the NAACP, however, is that they are often criticized, at least during this period of history, for working within the system too much. They weren't willing to take big enough or bold enough of steps to make a difference. And you will see prominent figures of the civil rights movements like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X kind of stepping away from them as they advance in their careers. But Rosa Parks within the NAACP, she is the secretary of E.D. Nixon. And one of the stories that kind of stood out to me when we're discussing her work in the NAACP is her work in the case of Recy Taylor. In 1944, Mrs. Taylor was walking home from church when a group of 6 white men abducted and raped her, and nothing happened. One of the men even came forward to authorities and confessed what they had done, and nothing was being done in reaction to that. So the NAACP sent Rosa Parks down there to deal with it. She not only investigated the case, but she also started a letter writing campaign. And because of her efforts, a special grand jury was held for Recy Taylor. Nothing ever happened to the men who attacked her, but they did, through her actions, Rosa Parks gave Recy Taylor a story. And then we can't talk about Rosa Parks without discussing the events on the evening of December 1st, 1955, when 42-year-old Rosa was driving home from a long day at work. She was sitting in a segregated bus in the back of the bus, and as the night goes on, the bus starts to fill up and more white passengers start to board. Many of the Black passengers stand up. They start to stand in the middle, and the driver of the bus even announces that Rosa Parks needs to get up and give her seat. That is what is expected at the time, and she refuses. And because of this, she is arrested. She goes to court. She is tried, and on December 5th, she is fined $10 plus $4 in court fees. She appeals this. It goes through the courts. But her actions start a 381-day long bus boycott, which I don't think anyone at the time really anticipated. I guess at this point, it is kind of important to clarify the fact that a lot of people assume that this action was taken out of like a moment of kind of like spontaneity or simply because she was tired. Rosa Parks states multiple times that it was not so much just like a spur of the moment thing. Like she was just honestly tired of living under this system of oppression. The boycott itself, I think it's important to mention that it wasn't necessarily something that had never been thought of before. Multiple people had taken part in similar action. In 1954, the Women's Political Council, or the WPC, had a meeting with the mayor to discuss how many Black individuals were facing like harassment and different things on public transportation. They even started a letter writing campaign. He never really responded to that. In 1955, the same year that Rosa Parks starts the bus boycott, not only does Claudette Colvin, who is 15 years old at the time, get arrested for refusing to give her seat up, but so does Marie Louise Smith. And despite all these women's different actions, nothing really happened. But when Rosa Parks gets arrested for not getting out of her seat, E.D. Nixon comes to her personally and asks if it's okay for them to build this kind of movement off of her action. And she accepts. And I think it's important to recognize the kind of character that she has for them to be confident enough for them to start like a whole movement off of her. And that's just because she was like an upstanding member of her community. So on December 2nd, the day after she is arrested, there's a meeting at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to discuss what they want to do. At that time, it's determined that they're going to start boycotting the buses on December 5th. At the time, they don't know it's going to last so long, but the day of December 5th, 90% of the Black community in Montgomery, Alabama does not use the bus system. They either walk or use taxis or like ride share. And that's, I think it's a pretty big move for the time. And that's generally not acknowledged. Like the fact that, number one, they could have faced violence for taking part in the boycott, but also like they could have lost their job if they didn't get to work on time or didn't have a solid means of transportation to their work. And then that evening, after like that day of success, they hold a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church, and a vote is taken not only to continue the movement, but that is also when the MIA, or the Montgomery Improvement Association, starts. And this is when Martin Luther King Jr. is elected president of the group and begins his rise into fame as a leader of the civil rights movement. And then December 8th, the MIA publishes their demands for the boycott to be drawn to an end. And their demands are that people will be treated with respect on buses, that they will have first come, first serve seating, and that Black bus operators will be available on predominantly Black bus routes. And then, like I said, the boycott lasted about a year. In reaction to it, there's like many different acts of violence, and the government also kind of lashes back at the movement. There are multiple different instances. Not only were the taxi drivers fined for what they were doing in participating with a boycott, but when people would carpool together to work, they would be followed and harassed and ticketed by police officers for doing nothing. In 1956, there were multiple bombings of leaders' homes, including E.D. Nixon and King. the men still chose to participate in the movement after facing that kind of violence. And then February of 1956, 80 members of the movement were fined for interfering with like commerce in the city. Martin Luther King himself was fined $500 or given the option to go to jail for a year. Despite the case's negativity and receiving this backlash, it's also important to recognize the fact that these cases drew attention and media to the bus boycott itself. Finally, it was not the bus boycott that drew the whole segregation of the buses to an end. It was actually a case called Browder versus Gale, which was when two lawyers, Fred Gray and Charles D. Langford, decided to take the stories of 4 Black women who had faced harassment on the bus systems into a court on February 1st, 1956. They did not include Rosa Parks in the case because they didn't want to muddle it. They didn't want to bring her own court cases into the courtroom. And they stated that they just wanted the case to be focused on one issue and one issue alone, and that's just the segregation on the buses. And on June 5th, 1956, in a 2-to-1 ruling, they decide that to ban segregation on the buses. And interestingly, they use Brown versus the Board of Education for their precedent for why they made that ruling. The boycott did not formally end until December 20th, and that's simply because Martin Luther King did not want to end the boycott before formal action had taken place to desegregate the buses. Now, the impact of Rosa Parks and her movement, she incited an incident that would push desegregation in many different sectors of American society. It showed the power of peaceful protest to Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders in general. It drew media attention to violence and segregation that many Black citizens were facing. And it was a jumping off platform for not only Martin Luther King Jr., but also the sit-in movements that were going to take place in buses, lunch counters, and waiting rooms all over the country. What happened to Rosa Parks? After the bus boycott took place, she faced threats. She was unemployed from her job, and she even had to move to Detroit, Michigan in 1957 to escape kind of like the backlash. Despite everything she faced, she joined the NAACP in Michigan and started the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute of Self-Development. And in both of these things, she focused on finding safe and affordable housing for Black members of her community. And in 1999, she won a Congressional Medal of Honor for her actions. At the end of the day, I think it's really important to acknowledge that Rosa Parks was a person who not only was just like genuinely kind and amazing, but that her life cannot be reduced down to a single moment in time, that she was actively working in her communities for decades before she had that one moment on the bus, and that she would continue to help people despite the violence and aggression that she was facing. And with that, these are my references, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.